Hello, I'm Anneliese from Eye Candy Quilts, and today I want to talk to you about sewing knit clothing without using a serger, so sewing knits on a domestic machine. Okay, so this is just a quick rundown of things. This is a domestic machine, and so which is just a regular sewing machine that many of you, most of you have. So it can be any brand, it doesn't matter, but it looks like this. There's one needle, there's one spool of thread. It's a machine, you feed it through. It can have zigzag stitch or fancy stitches if you want. That's about it. Behind me, this guy is a serger or an overlocker. So that machine is a little bit different. And honestly, it's still intimidating to me. So I'm sorry, kids of 4-H that I judge every year. You do get more points if you use a serger, even though it's easier. Just throwing that out there. Anyway. So a serger needs, I think, I'm pretty certain, it's been a while, needs at least 2 spools up to 4 spools of thread to run at a time. And what it does is it runs the stitch in a different way. So your domestic machine runs a straight stitch, one needle, straight stitch, and you can either go straight, 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 or it can go zigzag, zigzag like this, okay? And a serger pulls thread, multiple threads, and it covers the edge of the seam, or does different things. But it also has a blade at the side that you can activate to cut off the extra seam allowance. So if something is serged, it generally only has a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So that's a difference. Domestic machine, you can do any seam allowance you want, whether it's a 1/4 of an inch or you know, clothing is a 1/2 of an inch or 5/8 of an inch, whatever. You can do whatever. Sergers are generally 1/4 of an inch. So that's another difference. The other thing with a serger, like I said, it can be intimidating. It's a little, not that it's difficult, it's just, you know, new things are always a little bit, I get it. I am the same. I've had this for years. I don't use it. It's fine. I have it in case I really, really need it, but pretty much anything I want to do with that, I do with this, which is why I'm talking to you today. So, when you sew with knits, unlike sewing with, for a woven fabric where the threads are over, under, and they're locked and there's not really stretch to them. When you sew with a knit, and I'm wearing a knit shirt for just this occasion, they stretch by themselves. So if you have a seam and it just has the regular straight stitch, which works with the over, under, that will not stretch while the rest of your shirt will. So the problem with that is that you have basically a stress point, because you have a part where it's not moving the way everything else is. So you have a chance for, you know, garments to break or seams to pop if they're a stress point, or it just not to fit correctly because it's not moving the way the rest of the garment is. So when you use but you can still get whatever you need done with a domestic machine. Now I have examples here. The main thing, I've seen it called a double stitch, if that makes sense. The main thing to do with sewing knits on a domestic is you sew a straight stitch. There's first, so I'm going to show you right here. Ooh, where's it? There it is. So you sew a straight stitch first. Okay, so this is a mimosa tee that I made that I turned inside out. So the instructions for this were to do a double stitch, and so you can see it here. So it's pretty easy to do. You just do a straight stitch first wherever your seam allowance should be, and then along the edge you do a zigzag, and it's nice to catch the edges, and it mimics that overlocking serger movement so that it stays together and it mimics a serger. This is nice. It had a 1/4 inch seam allowance as part of the pattern, which is great because you didn't have to trim off anything and it wasn't a bulky seam. This was a different pattern. This was the toaster sweater. And the seam allowance is here. Sorry, I wore this to work the other day. I don't know which way is inside or out. Ha! Okay, so the seam allowances here are still very neat, but the seam allowance was for a 5/8 seam allowance or a 1/2 inch, something other than a 1/4. I don't remember. But what I did was a straight stitch, and then the edge, they recommended doing a broken zigzag where it's not just stitch, 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 stitch. It's multiple stitches in between, so it's stitch, 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 stitch. So it's more stitches in between the top, the peak and valley of the zigzag stitch. I will say that this is, they said it's stretchier, and I would agree. However, it takes a lot longer, and I don't know that for me, it's stretchy enough to make a difference, at least in the clothing that I was doing. But it is another option if you like that better, or if for some reason your machine does that better. So the only thing about this method was because it's not a 1/4 inch seam, I had to do the zigzag of whatever variety and then trim away afterwards. So I don't have that true catching of all of the seam allowance, encapsulating the edge and making sure that it's all together. But seeing as it's a knit and they don't ravel, it's fine. The other thing to remember about sewing with knits is that whenever you have top stitching, which is again adding a seam any place, whether it's a construction, it's not a construction seam, generally it's a decorative or a little bit more, less for stability, more for, you know, design, or hemming counts too as top stitching. If you do a straight stitch there, it's still not going to stretch. So you could have things like hems falling out or hems curling and various other things. So you need to do top stitching as a zigzag. So that way, so this is the hem of a shirt. So we want to make sure that this bottom still stretches just like the rest of the garment. So if it was just a regular straight stitch, which is what I did over here, whoop, too many clothes, but it doesn't stretch as much, and you can sort of, when you pull it, you sort of feel the tension. And as far as, I'm not going to go back and change it, and I did it on purpose. That sounds weird, I'm doing the wrong thing on purpose, but this is an oversized shirt. I didn't really want to mess with the zigzag. This works for me. So that's the other thing with any of this, is like I am always for constructing clothing, constructing quilts the correct way, because construction, we lost a quilt. Okay, I fixed it. The fur child is messing with the quilt. Anyway, so the point is with construction is that you want to make sure it's constructed a particular way for a reason, whether that's so it wears better, or that the fabric hangs correctly on your body, or it hangs correctly for piecing a quilt, so you don't have cat bias that you're messing with. It's there for a reason. So you need to know why you're doing it, or why you should do it a certain way, before you truly make the decision to say, no, I'm going to do this way because of these reasons. So like I said, if you top stitch, you want to top stitch with a zigzag to make sure you give it stretch. And then when you construct a garment, you want to use a double stitch. And so again, the double stitch is straight, 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 and then a zigzagged edge. And your zigzag could be either just a regular zigzag or a broken up zigzag. But yes, you can do it. Oh, and don't forget your needle. I almost forgot. Your needles are very important. You want to use a jersey needle or a ballpoint needle. That is right what I have here. They're marked that way. You can buy them that way. The difference in needles is going to be that point that goes through, so you're not going to split your threads as you're sewing, so it'll just make things stitch more smoothly, and you won't have skip stitches and things like that. So if you're sewing with, if you forget and you're having, you know, skip stitch problems or tension problems, then that might be one of the first things that you check your needle. Are you sewing with a needle that's meant for knits? So I hope this helped you out, just give you some tips and pointers to get started. Knits aren't scary. You can do it, and you can especially do it with a regular machine. You don't need anything fancy. So again, I'm Anneliese from Eye Candy Quilts. Thanks for joining us for Me Made May, and I hope to see you back soon. Bye.